Howdy. Today we're going to discuss Module 9 on public opinion. We'll have two brief lectures. We'll begin with a discussion of what is public opinion, and then we will close with a discussion of the science and art of interpreting public opinion polls. So, what is public opinion? Well, let's have a little context first, because public opinion plays a very important role in democracy because of its close relationship to the democratic principle of popular sovereignty. And if you'll recall, popular sovereignty just means that in a democracy, government needs to be responsive and accountable to the people. And to be responsive to the people means that what government does agrees with what the governed want government to do. And in order to agree with what the people want done, then government must first find out what it is that people want done. And so the question becomes, how do we find out what people want government to do? And one answer that we're going to talk about in this topic is scientific polling. But scientific polling is a relatively modern, or is a modern technology. And it really didn't begin to take the form of a science that we could rely on until the mid-1930s. But the basic idea has been around for a long time. It wasn't until the 1930s that Gallup and some other pioneers began to figure out just exactly what sampling meant. But the idea is that we take a relatively small and manageable sample and measure opinions or other characteristics in that sample. And then, based on what we find in that sample, we want to infer that what exists out in a much larger population is the same or very close to what we found in the sample. And as I said, George Gallup, the founder of the Gallup poll, was a pioneer. And he published a book in the 1930s where he called public opinion surveys as the pulse of democracy. It provided a technology to take the public's temperature, so to speak, and to ask people what they wanted and what they felt about things. And Gallup thought that this was going to be just a great boon to democracy because it would allow a relatively quick way for government officials to check what it was that the people want and to provide guidance for what policymakers ought to do. We're going to find out in a minute that Gallup's enthusiasm for public opinion polls is a little overblown. But we need to understand that we've been doing democracies for a lot longer since a long time before the mid 20th century. And so how is it that democracies in general, and American democracy in particular, found out what people wanted before we had the advantage of these public opinion polls? And the general answer is that the way democracies found out what people wanted is through voting and participation in politics, which is the topic that we're going to talk about in the next module. But for now, I want to place Gallup's notions about public opinion polls in context. And there were critics at the time and political scientists today have concluded that public opinion alone is not an adequate guide to governing. The more we learned about democracy, the more we studied democracy, what we discovered, and I hope that it's beginning to come through in this class, that democratic governance is a complex process. And in the United States in particular, this representative democracy that the Constitution established has all kinds of provisions in it that were designed and intended to insulate policymakers from public opinion. We talked about some of that before, the longer term for the Senate, direct indirect election of the Senate originally, electoral college, and so forth. And so governing a democracy is a complex process, and especially in the United States where it's designed to be insulated from public opinion. We've also learned many of the important limitations of public opinion polls. There's always measurement error, and we're going to talk about some sources of measurement error in a minute. But we've also learned that when researchers or interviewers ask an American their opinion about something, a lot of times this quote opinion is not really an opinion based on any kind of knowledge or thought out rational process. It's just based on ignorance. It's just the respondent gives a response off the top of their head. And we're also going to learn that public opinion polls or how to interpret what public opinion polls mean is not always straightforward, that there's some ambiguity. But we've also learned that this modern technology of public opinion polling is a very useful way to understand human behavior, understand political behavior, and understand public opinion. And it can make a useful contribution to our understanding, but we need to understand the limitations of those polls, and we also need a basic understanding of probability. So what is public opinion? Well, basically, public opinion is just the sum of individual attitudes about an issue or question. This simple, straightforward definition is generally accurate, but it really oversimplifies a complex concept. Because public opinion is more than just summing up how many people are for or against something. And so we're going to talk about public opinion as consisting of four basic elements. The first element of public opinion is direction, and that's the one that we usually talk about. But we also need to understand that public opinion also has a stability component. There's intensity that needs to be taken into account, and there's salience. So, what are these elements? Well, direction, as I've indicated, is the first and most obvious element of public opinion, and that's just the direction of whether opinion is positive or negative about something. And so there are a variety of ways that we can ask people to determine direction. We can ask if they agree or disagree, or support or oppose, like or dislike, whether they want more or less, whether they're Democrat or Republican. All of those are asking Americans for which direction or which side they prefer. Now, let's take a concrete example. Let's look at these trends in public opinion on abortion. Now, this chart is from the Gallup polls, and Gallup has been doing multiple polls every year asking Americans about their opinions on abortion since 1974. And why did they start polling in 1974? Well, if you'll recall Roe versus Wade, which recognized the woman's right to choose as an individual right in 1973. And the other advantage of using this is that since the Gallup organization has done it, they've used consistent question wording all along. And so, if we look at this chart, what we find is that there is an average of 25 or 26%, goes up and down a little bit, but generally around 25 or 26% of Americans say abortion should never be legal. That's taking a human life. And there's slightly more, but not a whole lot more, individuals who say abortion should be always legal. It should be completely up to the decision of the mother. It's none of government's business. And then up here we have a majority, sometimes a clear majority, and sometimes a not so clear majority of individuals who express an opinion about that they think abortion should be legal under certain circumstances. And Gallup gives them several options, and some of those options are it should be legal only to save the health and the life of the mother. That's a fairly close to the pro-life end, all the way to the other end, where some people would say, well, I think abortion should be legal if the child is going to be born with serious birth defects, or if the mother is poor and can't afford to raise the children. And so unlike these never legal and always legal, sometimes legal is a mixture or a range of legality. But if we look at these trends, if you're a policymaker, if you're a member of Congress and you're voting on a bill dealing with abortion, to ban abortion or to legalize abortion or whatever it might be, and you want to set aside your own personal, moral, and religious values, and you just want you want the vote in a way that the American people want you to vote. And so you look at these polls, and how do you decide how to vote? And the answer is you would have a very difficult time, because the direction of public opinion on abortion is not clear. While there is a majority or close to a majority that says it should be legal under certain circumstances, there's a lot of range in there, and there are a slightly larger percentage that say it should always be legal than those who say it should never be legal, but that's not a big difference. So the direction of public opinion on abortion is not clear. Well, that brings us to the second element of public opinion, and that is stability. And the stability of public opinion just refers to how likely is it that opinions are going to change directions on this particular issue. If we look back at that example on abortion, what we've already determined that the direction of opinion on abortion is not clear. But if you look back at the chart, that unclear opinion is remarkably stable. And so I've drawn some trend lines through here. And if you'll recall, these regression lines, this number here reflects the slope, and a slope of 0 means there's no change. And so there's a slight negative slope here. There are slight positive slopes here, but for all practical purposes, the slope of those lines is 0, which means that the percentage of individuals of Americans in each of these three options really hasn't changed significantly over time. So that's just remarkable stability. Now, let's look at another issue similar to abortion in the sense that it raises some fundamental moral and religious and issues, and that is the issue of same-sex marriage. And when we look at polling on same-sex marriage, what we find is that public opinion on same-sex marriage has been much less stable, although the direction is usually clear. Now, just let me tell you a little bit about this. Notice that this chart begins in 1994, and that's because before the mid-1990s, whether a same-sex couple should be allowed to get married was just unheard of. And there was an event in the early 90s in Hawaii where a justice of the peace in the state of Hawaii interpreted the Hawaii Constitution and granted a marriage license to a same-sex couple. And so this one little event of this justice of the peace in Hawaii just generated or placed the issue of same-sex marriage on the political agenda. And throughout the 90s, there still weren't very many polls, or not very often, and that's why there are these long gaps in here of these lines that I just connected. But if you just look at the line here, we can see from the 90s until the mid 2000s, 2/3 of Americans said, "Oh no, same-sex marriage should not be legal," and around a fourth said, "Yeah, it should be legal." But if you'll notice that those who said it should not be legal, that opinion declined and declined, so that in recent polls, it's only about 30% or so of Americans say it should be legal or should not be legal, and 2/3 of Americans say that it should be legal. And so I know this sounds like a relatively long period of time, but it's not as long as that stability on abortion. And so notice that we've gone from a situation in the 90s and 2000s where 2/3 of Americans were opposed to same-sex marriage to a situation in recent years where 2/3 think it should be supported. And you can see the lack of stability here. I mean, I've drawn those same regression lines through here, and so as you can see, the trend line of opinion on same-sex marriage not being legal has a negative slope, and so the opinion on same-sex marriage being legal has a positive slope. And notice that there's always a clear difference, except in this period here where those two trend lines are crossing. Now, I've taken a closer look at this, and you can get a better idea of how these trends started. I just calculated what was the average percentage of Americans that said abortion should not be legal or should be legal in different periods, from 1994 to 2005, from 2006 to 2010, from 2011 to 2014, and then 2015 to the present. And so, as you can see, opinion on opposed to same-sex marriage goes from 60% down to about half, to about 40%, down to 35%, and opinion supporting same-sex marriage goes from about 1/3 of Americans to about 40%, and then crosses a line here, crosses and becomes more favorable in this period between 2011 and 2014, and has continued to rise. So with same-sex marriage, except for that brief period where opinion was crossing, there's always been a clear difference of opinion. But there's been relatively, I mean, the kind of change that we're seeing over this period of a few decades is just really unusual. A third element of public opinion is intensity. And intensity just refers to how strongly people hold a particular attitude or belief. Now, we've already talked about public opinion polls that attempt to measure intensity when we were discussing party identification. And we noted that we measure party identification with the question, generally speaking, do you consider yourself to be a Democrat, an independent, or Republican, or what? And then we ask whether you're a strong Democrat or a Republican, or an independent that leans one way or the other. And so with this scale, we've got intense Democrats on one end, intense Republicans on the other, and then in the middle we have independents, or independents that lean Democrat or lean Republican, that are much less intense. Other political issues, when we ask people about their political ideology, we typically give them a variety of choices ranging from very liberal to liberal, or sometimes somewhat liberal, moderate, conservative, very conservative, and so a number of attempts to try and measure intensity. The fourth element of public opinion is salience. And salience is a word that just refers to how important an issue is to the public. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, isn't that the same thing as intensity? And the answer is no. Salience and intensity are not the same thing. When we talk about an issue being important, that means the individual feels like this is an issue that really affects my life, and they may not feel very strongly about it, but they do recognize that it's a very important issue. And we also know that some people, maybe many people, have very intense attitudes about abortion or same-sex marriage or the environment, but none of those issues, well, with the exception of the environment maybe, rarely, if ever, end up as among the most important problems. And so the way we tend to measure salience of public opinion in the aggregate in America is just with questions. What do you think are the 3 or 5 most important issues that government needs to deal with? And so this is a common question that's been asked for decades and decades. And consistently, the issues that come up as the most important problems are the economy and war and national security issues are always among the top 3 issues, and then other issues, crime or something. So here is a chart that I prepared that just goes back to 2001 up through 2018. And so, as you can see, in the 2000, the national security. Remember, this is after 9/11 and the war on terror and the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so that was a very salient issue for public opinion. It falls down here in the 2000s, but then it's always up there. And then just these general questions about the economy and jobs is always very important. And you don't see abortion on this chart because it never shows up in there. Some energy and environment shows up sometimes a little bit in this period. Healthcare also shows up here. Here's healthcare because healthcare was after Obamacare was passed in 2010, and so there was a lot of debate in the presidential election and in Congress on that issue, and so healthcare goes up, and after it passed, Republicans were strongly opposed to it and have been trying to defeat it ever since. So it stayed among the most important problems. Now, one I put on here just to show you how things can change, and the importance of big government. The deficit's too big, government's too powerful, taxes are too high. Now, that's separate from views about the economy. And notice that until the 2010s and 2012, that issue really didn't show up. Well, what happened in 2010? Well, in the period running up to 2010, this is when the so-called Tea Party movement was gaining ground, and they really got mobilized in the 2010 midterm elections in opposition to Obamacare, and a lot of the rhetoric in the Tea Party movement dealt with big government. We need to reduce the size of government. The deficit's too big, and so forth. But so political events or political movements can move something up into the top 3 or 5 most important issues, but consistently the economy and national security, war and peace issues are always there. So that concludes our discussion of just defining public opinion. And so next time we will go on and then we'll talk about the science and art of interpreting public opinion polls.